So sort of wrapping up a little bit here, but I one thing that struck me, I think it was in the paper you gave to ICTAM.
Uh-huh.
Is that I don't know if I'm getting
International
my
Conference on
acronyms
Traditional
correct.
Asian Medicine.
Yes. In that paper, you mentioned that the majority of the other pre-song herbal texts or formularies were really just kind of one-to-one symptom-based uh, formularies. During the song, it seems they discarded that method as being somewhat impractical. What was it about these symptom-based uh, formularies that perhaps we could learn from the example of the song in terms of their implausibility in clinical practice?
Well, I'm going to break it into two parts because my actual argument is a little bit different from that.
Yeah.
What's happened is among historians, there's an argument that prior to the song, that there was this method of prescribing called symptom matching. And the idea was that you had these massive formularies like Sun Simiao's, Beiji Qianjin Yao Fang, which has more than 6,000 formulas in it. Um, and then, of course, Wang Tao's had even more. And it basically, all what physicians did was they simply tried to match, these formulas. The argument says that these formularies don't present theoretical information. Therefore, it must be that physicians simply matched the symptoms listed for the formulas against the symptoms of the patient until they found the right formula. Baba boom, baba bing. Now we prescribe, right? Um, and my argument is that isn't possible for a couple of good reasons. The most basic one is the number of formulas involved. It's simply way too high. There is no way. And I memorized a lot in my life, and I believe in memorization. And I know that the human capacity for memorization is far greater than most people think. But there's no way that physicians were on a regular basis memorizing 8,000 plus formulas along with all the lists of symptoms associated with them. It's clinically impossible. It wouldn't have worked. So that I think from that point alone, we can rule out the whole notion of symptom matching as a possibility. Um, so what were they doing, and why do these texts look like that? Well, they look like this in part because you have to read them the right way. Most of these texts do have some theoretical discussion in the introduction to each chapter in the first place. They're not completely atheoretical. But more importantly is what were these texts written for? And this is what has not been recognized, in my opinion, is that texts like the Qianjin Yaofang, the Qianjin Yifang of Sun Simiao, the Wang Tao's, White Hai Mi Yao, Ge Hong's Zhou Hou Beiji Fang, these are not meant to be textbooks for practicing doctors. They are essentially a handbook to have around for a layperson to use when someone in your family gets sick. And we can even see this in the names. The Beiji of Beiji Qianjin Yaofang and of Zhouhou Beiji Fang means in preparation for emergencies. So the full title of the Qianjin Yaofang is really formulae worth 1,000 gold in preparation for emergencies. And Zhouhou Beiji Fang would then be formulae to keep close at hand in preparation for emergencies. And one of the great things about the Xiaopin Fang that we discussed earlier, the Jingfang Xiaopin, is that it has this lovely part of the introduction where he says, all of the great old families, maintain a book in which they write down all the formulae they found that worked. And he said, and basically what he's telling us is it was common, and this makes sense. You think about the times when medicine is not so easy to come by. Good doctors, especially, are hard to come by. That well-off families kept books in which they recorded every formula they used that worked and what it worked for. So my argument essentially is you have to remember that people who wrote these things like Sun Simiao, Ge Hong, Wang Tao were not physicians in the normal sense. There's some debate now even as to whether Sun Simiao seriously practiced medicine or not. Regardless, I think it's pretty clear he was not a practicing physician in the sense that he didn't have You know, he didn't go to the clinic every day by any means. It does seem he had friends come by when they were sick to get his help. So maybe he did practice like that. We don't know for sure. But regardless, I think we can say safely that these formularies from the Tong and earlier are really grand, very much more sophisticated versions of these little home formularies that the families kept normally, produced by men who had a serious interest in medicine, but not with the intention that they would be a textbook by any means. They're still basically a reference work. So somebody gets sick, oh, I go look at Sun Simiao's book until I find an appropriate formula, and we try that. So that's the first thing. As far as how they were diagnosing and prescribing back then, my guess is that we don't really know. We see bits and pieces of it showing up occasionally in some texts, but my suspicion is that we don't really have that good of a knowledge of what was going on. We may eventually find some more, I don't know. Now, to come to the song, because the second part of your question there, as far as how it plays out in modern times, the song people didn't think that the people before their time were symptom matching. They did, however, think that the common physicians, the non-elite men who were the most common physicians of the time, were doing something too simplistic. And they complain about these things, like they say, these common physicians, they only ask, is it a yin pattern or a yang pattern? Zhongjing had 3 yin and 3 yang. How can they just stop at yin and yang, Or they'll say, one that we do know has a long history is this idea that for the first 3 days of cold damage, you sweat the patient. After that, you purge the patient. And the Song medical authors that, form this new literati medicine that I talk about hate that idea. And they use Zhongjing against it. They say, look, Zhongjing didn't buy into that. He says sometimes it can take 7 days to go through the Taiyang channel, And on the other hand, sometimes you can be the Yang within 3 days. So, they're very much against this kind of routinized, mechanistic application of formulae. So they're very supportive of the idea that every individual case has to be worked out. And they'll tell you, all you can do is you look at the pulse, you look at the signs and symptoms, you find out where it is. Is it the interior, the exterior? Is it replete or vacuous? Is it hot or cold? It should sound familiar to all of us, right? They're basically telling you, go down the list and figure out what's going on. And one of their favorite lines was about illness was, if you're off by a hair, it's no different than being 10,000 miles away. Basically, you miss it by an inch, you miss it by a mile. Or as they like to say, as the old Americans saying, it almost only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. So it doesn't count in formulae either.
Where did the Shanghanlun fit into that paradigm? Was it a text for lay persons, or was it a text for, just everyday physicians?
In older times, we don't really know.
Okay.
By the Song, it seems pretty clear that only people who are fairly serious about medicine were reading the Shanghanlun. Okay. And the way we know this is that there were a series of texts written and published that were devoted to simplifying and popularizing the Shanghanlun. And if you look at them carefully, what you see is they're very clearly trying to give a sort of outline of the Shanghanlun and how to treat things, complete with formula to use. But I think it's pretty clear that because of the difficulty of the text and the fact that it's not, as we all know, written in it's not like you can pick up the text and say, I want to find out how to treat headache, and then go look for it very easily, right? I mean, it's buried in there. If you haven't learned it already, you just don't know it. So they created text where you could do things like that, where you could look it up and say, oh, this person has cold damage and a headache. What do I use? And so I would say I'll probably only, some of the people who were clearly lay people, but they were lay people with a very serious interest in medicine.
Okay. And my last question was, could you just give a brief synopsis on the difference between the Tang Dynasty version of the Shanghanlun and the received text that most of us work with today?
The Tong version, which is it's a kind of a funny name to give it because I call it the Tong Edition in Chinese frequently. What it is chapters 9 and 10, if I'm remembering right, of the Qianjing Yifang, Sun Simiao's second text, published 30 years after the Qianjing Yaofang. And it's actually very close to the received text of the Shang Hanlun in most respects. It's shorter, so it's missing a few lines. It is in a somewhat different order, but even the order is still close to the received edition, just not entirely the same. It does a few things, like it'll group together all the lines on a certain formula, for example. So all the Guizhi Tang lines get grouped together, and that causes some changes in the ordering of the lines from the received edition. The biggest change, though, is that like the Jingui Yuhan Jing, it has a habit of simplifying otherwise rather complex and hard to understand lines. So in my dissertation, the one I give it an example of is line 52, where it's one of the lines on spontaneous sweating, basically. And there are a number of features of this line in the version that we consider the sort of standard version nowadays that are just weird in the Chinese. And the kind of thing that doesn't come through in translation well because you have to make a choice when you're translating about how am I going to render this, and in so doing, you get rid of the ambiguity and the weirdness that was there in the original text. But when you look at this text, this line in the Tong edition or in the Jingui Yuhan Jing, which are very close to one another in how they render the line, they've eliminated the ambiguity and the confusion, which is why I suspect that both of them are actually later editions, and that what we call the standard edition now is closer to the original Han Dynasty version, because quite bluntly, a text that old ought to be messy and confusing. It shouldn't be so clean. And I have my own particular version of how to install that line's difficulties, which is interesting, but too long to explain here. But yeah, I suspect that the Tong edition, like the Jingui Yuhan edition, probably underwent some serious editing, possibly by Wang Shuhe, who knows, but by somebody at any rate, because they clean up the messy spots in the text.
Okay.
I would mention briefly the most interesting edition, by the way, to my mind, is the Japanese Kohei edition, which is highly controversial, but I'm inclined to accept it as authentic. And if I'm right in doing so, it is an edition of it that dates of the text that dates back to the Tang, and which is the only surviving edition which preserves the comments that were made on the text, which later on, in the course of people rewriting the text, got merged into the lines of the text itself. These are the famous parenthetical comments that they talk about in the Shang Hanlun. We have this comment that'll be, it's clearly not part of the main line, and it's just stuck there in the middle of the line. In this text, many of those are actually marked as comments. And so I believe it may be one of the most historically important editions of the text out there, and it's very understudied right now, because the Japanese have largely said they don't believe it anymore. They're like, no, it's not authentic. But the Chinese and me are coming around us to a different point of view. So who knows?
Okay.
What will happen in the future?
Well, I look forward to hearing more. And again, I'd just like to thank Stephen Boyington for speaking with me today. Your research on the Shang Hanlun, as I said in the early part of the interview, I truly value scholars like yourself and what you're doing so that the English-speaking community of Chinese medicine practitioners can better understand some of these source texts that really shaped and formed the foundation of Chinese medicine practice. So thank you, Stephen, for sharing with us. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate you sharing your research. And I know you just finished up on your dissertation, so I want to wish you good luck on your defense.